This is The Good Fight. This is Only the Super Rich Can Save Us, Ralph's latest. This is Winning the Insurance Game. And without further ado, here is Ralph Nader.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ivana. Without Ivana, this gathering would not have occurred. That's as certain as anything can be. Thank you very much. Also for all the people who worked with her and are here tonight. I also want to thank David Robb, the head of the adult education sector of the All Souls Unitarian Church, for making the facilities available. Now, this evening, this is not going to be a conventional excoriation of the forces of darkness, except to establish a certain predicate. You wouldn't be here tonight if you weren't fairly well-read or deeply well-read about the ailments of our society, the concentration of power, the abuse of corporate power, the takeover of government functions by corporations, and the deepening of the corporate state. In fact, we live in a golden age of expose documentaries, live in a golden age of muckraking books. Never in our history have more books come out and more articles and more documentaries about the abuses of concentrated power, political, economic, technological, you name it. What's remarkable about it is that the more material that is brought to people's attention through print, through television, radio, internet, the less effect it seems to have. Didn't you notice that? I don't think there could be another Unsafe at Any Speed or Silent Spring or The Other America. The impact of those books. Something has severely decayed in our society, and that something is a multifaceted phenomenon all by itself. It's quite interesting how children are raised in this country to think that we're number one in the world, and that, of course, makes comparative evaluation of other societies off the chart, off the screen. If we're number one, why do we have to worry about anyone else? But I'm always was impressed by after World War II, when Western Europe was in total devastation, cities, countryside, destitute, complete cessation of any kind of organized activity other than resistance. That after World War II, they came out of it devastated. We came out of it number one in terms of power and economic output. And yet, look what they did through their trade unions, their cooperatives, their multi-party system. They demanded and received for all their people what does not exist in this country 65 years later, after World War II. They demanded full health insurance for everybody. They demanded decent public transit, 4-week paid vacation, tuition-free university education, paid child care, paid maternity leave, paid family sick leave, and for the bottom third of their workers, better wages and better pensions than this country. For all their workers, not just unionized one. Now just think of what that says about our highly touted democracy in this country. That we, coming out the wealthiest and most powerful, are now at the bottom of the scale on these indicators. We have the highest infant mortality in the Western world, the highest percentage of poverty in the Western world, the highest percentage of child poverty in the Western world, the highest level of consumer debt in the Western world, the worst public transit in the Western world, the highest university tuition in the Western world, and we still don't have paid vacations for all our people. That's just for starters. I won't bore you with the rest. But that deserves a severe introspection. It deserves an analysis of why this has not happened. It cannot be because people are not aware of their deprivations. There's never been a society in the world where there is greater awareness. There's more information, it's everywhere, and it's cheap. If you don't get it on NBC, CBS, and in the New York Times, you can get it on C-SPAN, or you can get it on the internet, or you can get it by reading The Nation, or Progressive, or any number of newsletters. It's easy. So the first excuse as to why a society doesn't get its justice in order is non-existent. There are far more people who know what the abuses are than ever before, and they can keep up to date with them in case they suffer from the phenomenon known as justice fatigue based on old information. The second excuse that's often given is that the two parties dominate the scene and you can't generate new political energies in the electoral arena. And to some extent, that is not an unsubstantiated excuse, but it's one that can be overcome. It is very hard for third parties, as many of you know. You've been on street corners trying to get petitions for signatures for third-party independent candidates. It's very hard to get on. It has never been harder in our history for third-party independent candidates to get on. There are 50 state different laws. If you run for federal office, you've got to adhere to 50 state different laws. And the difficulty is much greater than the 19th century when people could get on the ballot in many states by just printing the ballot. And if they had to do more, it was not that severe an obstacle. Oh, that's an obstacle. However, nobody can stop people from voting for people they believe in once they are on the ballot. And there have been quite a few third-party and independent candidates, local, state, and national, on the ballot. But because they're viewed as not being able to win, people don't vote for the people on the ballot they believe in. They vote for people who turn against them repeatedly and turn their back on them. A kind of electoral masochism that our country has taken to new depths. Labor unions, they were relied on to be a countervailing force. Corporations have crushed them. They've crushed them with globalization. They've crushed them with Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. They've crushed them without purchasing and renting elected officials, and they've crushed them in the media battles. As a result, the percentage of American workers who are unionized is the lowest in 65 years, and in the private sector, lower than over 70. In the corporate sector, lower than over 70 years. Well, we have, let's see, what else do we have in terms of countervailing forces? Well, how about progressive churches? They were very much in the forefront against slavery. They were in the forefront in the civil rights movement, especially north of the Mason-Dixon line. But now that's changed into what is called the Christian right, and the political movements that are nourished by it. And of course, televangelism is pretty much not reflective of William Sloane Coffin's type of social justice. We have Glenn Beck in place of that now. And so we have the indicators are the predictable result of all this. Just look at the indicators, one after another. You can see whether it's unemployment, whether it's poverty, whether it's consumer debt, whether it's toxic waste, whether it's political corruption, whether it's concentrated power in Washington, whether it's bailouts, handouts, giveaways, subsidies to corporations, on and on and on. The indicators are not good. In Washington, D.C., 40% of the adults are functionally illiterate. 40% of the adults are functionally illiterate. The city ponied up $650 million for a baseball stadium, and its library budget in 26 branch libraries and the Martin Luther King Central Library has just barely hit $40 million. So you see, you have a culture in decay, a politics in decay, an economy in decay. Now all this gives us a great excuse of being demoralized and discouraged, and takes us to new heights in rationalizing our futility. Of course, deep down we know the people have the power. We have the Constitution on our side. I don't recall the preamble starting "we the corporation." It starts "we the people." Through our government, we create every corporation in the land by charter. Through rogue judicial decisions of the Supreme Court, these artificial entities called corporations have all the constitutional rights that real people have. Can you imagine giving an articulated, gigantic robot that could raise capital, hire people, produce products, market products, produce profits, produce bonuses, produce stock options, and this gigantic robot is given all the constitutional rights that we have, except the right against self-incrimination, which they don't have to use very often anyway, because they're never hauled into court under the criminal laws very often. So we can wallow in this kind of demoralization, cut our teeth on the latest expose, 60 Minutes, maybe 2020, maybe It's Your Money on ABC, or various articles in Mother Jones and Washington Monthly, Nation Magazine, pick up books, terrific books, expose, and it sort of reaffirms what we believe about what's going on in this country. And there's a kind of high that people get from that. You know, just keep reading and keep seeing that what's wrong is very, very well documented, and our overall diagnosis is reified by all these materials. Nothing happens. How many times do we have to say nothing is happening of any significance in the major confrontations of concentrated power against the interests of the people and their descendants and the world environment? What? Nothing's happening. You can say, oh, well, there's a little effort here on climate change, and there's a little effort here on genetic engineering, but basically, it's a losing game. We're constantly slipping behind the forces of corporatism. And so you ask, well, why is that? Why is it that a majority of the American people want single-payer, full Medicare for all? Majority of the American people want a living wage. Try asking someone who works for Walmart, who's a die-hard conservative, whether that person is satisfied with $8.25 an hour. It's a majoritarian position, a living wage. The minimum wage in 1968, adjusted for inflation, would be $10 an hour. It's $7.25 an hour is the federal minimum wage, maybe a little higher in New York, Connecticut. There's a majoritarian position against criminal wars of aggression, even at the height of Bush-Cheney's propaganda, in the beating of the drums and the false pretenses, lies, and cover-ups in the months before 2003 March. There was a majority of the people, a slight majority of the people, without the benefit of any opposing party clarification of these lies the Democrats had rolled over, without being able to turn on the network news and get any kind of alternative voice warning about this reckless criminal war of aggression that was never declared by Congress. A little over half the people were opposed to it. Majoritarian positions are all over the place. Try consumer protection, credit cards, payday loans, predatory lending, mortgage rackets, corporate crime, fraud, and abuse is non-discriminatory. It exploits people regardless of their race, color, creed, gender, and sexual preference. And that's why there are majoritarian positions. Well, in a country where you have majoritarian positions, why isn't anything happening? Well, let me give you some examples of why it isn't happening. The struggle in Congress on health insurance took off the table single payer. They took off the table, Obama, the Democrats, and of course the Republicans, took off the table the majoritarian position held by the people, the doctors, and the nurses. At the same time, the drug industry and the health insurance industry fielded over 2,000 daily lobbyists on Capitol Hill. There are 535 members of Congress. And back up to those 2,000 lobbyists were a whole array of political action committees funneling money and massive media propaganda blast where the Chamber of Commerce has its own elaborate TV studio right in its headquarters, and all the various connections with insurance agents and other field operations in the country. Now, how many full-time lobbyists do you think were working on Capitol Hill on single payer? Full-time. 0. Partly because it was taken off the table, which is a nice way to pull the rug out from under any sustained effort. When you can't even get a hearing, when President Obama has 60 people at the White House and doesn't have one advocate for single payer, turning down Dennis Kucinich, for example, a member of his own party, when Senator Baucus refused to have any witness for single payer until doctors, nurses, and others stood up in the hearing, and they had to be arrested because they would cry out, "Why isn't there single payer?" Now that's a mismatch by anybody's definition, right? Take it at its interface, 0 to 2,000. That's why we don't get single payer. Because there's no money behind single payer to organize people in every congressional district, to bring back these members of Congress by the collar and put them in auditoriums and have them face the facts. Have them face why they are supporting legislation that will continue to produce 45,000 lives lost every year, which a Harvard Medical School study documented is the fatality toll of people who couldn't afford health insurance to get diagnosis and treatment. 45,000 lives is more than die on the highway. 45,000 lives is a huge casualty toll, and if you add all the sickness and injuries that persist or arise because people can't afford to get treatment, it's even worse. It's a huge bloodbath. And yet, nothing happens in terms of single payer. What if you had $150 million behind a single payer movement in the last year and a half? What's $150 million? Last I heard, George Soros made $3 billion in 2007. There are a lot of people who make that in 1 year, far more than ever before. There's nothing there. You cannot achieve justice without money. Let me put it that way. You can have willing organizers, unemployed. You can have media outlets, unused. You can have experts, untapped. But if you don't have money, you can't mount those kinds of campaigns, and majoritarian positions will mean nothing. Let's try another one, the drumbeat for war in Iraq. In the 6 months before the war, in March 2003, there's going to be a big rally in Washington on March 20, for those of you who want to go down and participate. And I understand Jonathan Tassini is here. You know Jonathan Tassini? Where are you, Jonathan? Yeah? He's a single-payer advocate, an anti-war advocate. and someone who's willing to put his hat in the electoral arena in the U.S. Senate race that's coming up, inside the Democratic Party, I might add. You know how rare that is? It's as rare as a Koh-i-Noor diamond. Now look at this for a moment. This struck me at the time when we were opposing that war. Veterans groups were against the war, not the big ones, but there was Veterans Against Peace, Against the War. All of these groups sent letters to President Bush asking for a meeting in the White House. National Council of Churches, student groups, women's groups, peace groups, labor groups, groups called retired intelligence officers organized against it, business groups organized against the war. There'd never been such a panorama. Environmental groups organized against the war. They sent 13 individual letters asking for their president to meet with him because he never met with anybody against the war. They didn't even get the courtesy of a robotic reply. 6 months before the war, 300 at least, we got up to that level, 300 top military retired officers, generals, admirals, colonels, and leading retired diplomats and former high national security officials, including James Baker and Brent Scowcroft, who were the two advisors to the first George Herbert Walker Bush, including General Zinni, retired, four-star general, Admiral Shanahan, retired, and many others, spoke out against the war. They wrote op-eds, they stepped forward, they wrote letters to the editor, testified. Nothing happened. The juggernaut from the White House had flattened the Democratic Party, had produced the national media into putty, and the three lies about going to war, weapons of mass destruction, etc., continued to penetrate the public psyche. Now there's someone else who came out against the war, George Soros. George Soros is a financial genius. He never loses money if the markets go up or go down. And he's a rather outstanding thinker on public issues, whether you agree with him or not. He's very analytical, very cool, believes in an open society, believes in always keeping free people who disagree with you. He was against the war. Now suppose he put $300 million behind those 300 irrefutable, high-level, retired military, national security, and diplomatic Americans who spoke out against the war. Suppose he put them on mass media repeatedly. Suppose he gave them a platform in congressional hearings. Suppose he had them double and triple and quadruple their numbers. Nothing could have stopped their truth-telling. Bush and Cheney would have melted away in terms of their lies, deceptions, and cover-ups. That's how unsubstantiated those frauds were. It would have given backbone to the Democrats. And it would have brought out the greatest opposition to an insidious war in American history and stopped it. $300 million. There wasn't $1 million. There wasn't $500,000. The budget of Veterans Against Peace was $200,000. Veterans for Peace, I'm sorry. The Veterans for Peace was $200,000. Now you see, there's never any discussion of the financial resources that are requisite here. You have two tumultuous technologies, genetic engineering, pushed by Monsanto and Novartis and others, and nanotechnology. And there are three little groups raising alarms about genetic engineering. One started by Harvard and MIT scientists, Council for Responsible Genetics, out of Cambridge, and a couple other in Washington, etc. I don't think their total budget's $1 million. But look at the budget of Monsanto, changing the nature of nature. Look at the budget of Novartis. Look at their influence in Washington. Look how they corrupt academic science with corporate science. It's a mismatch. No wonder we're not hearing the voice of the people. There's no resources there. Even though you have the background of MIT, Harvard, and other scientists who are raising very serious questions about these technologies. How about student loan racket? Finally, Obama has come out that the student loans should be from the Department of Education. Why should they subsidize banks and companies like Sallie Mae, where if they make a profit, they keep it, and if they lose on a student loan default, you, the taxpayer, through Washington, makes it up. So they said, well, we can save like $90 billion in 10 years and put it back into student loans. Well, can you believe that the student loan industry is now on the counterattack in Congress, hiring the most influential lawyers, and they're trying to block the full elaboration of that reform? Now, who's on the other side? Are the students organized? Is there any money being put behind the forces of saving that kind of money and giving students a better break and no fine print where they can be sabotaged after they graduate with all kinds of fees? There's no money there. Suppose some multimillionaire said, you know, I'm getting bored sitting there in Beverly Hills or Scarsdale. I think I'm going to put $10 million into a major organizing drive on campus and off campus and get this legislation through. 100% it would succeed. There's almost nobody up there on Capitol Hill. 535 men and women put their shoes on every day like you and I. 1,500 corporations who don't have a single vote get their way with the majority of those 535 men and women again and again and again. And we're back home, and we're the only ones who have the vote. Resources are absolutely critical here. We have seen the commercialization of our country right down to childhood. The commercialization of marketing to children is a multi-billion-dollar industry, undermining parental authority, setting them up for junk food-induced diabetes, high blood pressure, violent programming, and making money and laughing all the way to the bank. There used to be a time in our country when direct marketing to children under 12 was verboten, except maybe for bubble gum. Now, it's open season. And so what we're seeing is the corporate upbringing of children, and when they get to be preteens, they have been fed by McDonald's, entertained by Disney, medicated by Pfizer, and on and on. And when they get to be teenagers, they even lose the privilege of cynicism. They're too busy text messaging to even have time for cynicism. And when they get to be in their 20s, what happens? Are they ready for their civic responsibilities? You ask 1,000 students at any college in the country, how many of you have never been in a Walmart, McDonald's, or shopping mall? Not one hand is raised except a recent immigrant from Finland. You ask them, how many of you have never been in a court of law as a spectator or have never been to a city council or town meeting? The hands go up. They're in the commercial arena, obviously. They are not in the public arena. That's what we have to look forward to. Unless we move our level of urgency to a new level of functionality. And that's what I want to talk about. We have paralysis by analysis. We really think cognition leads to ignition of action. We look at freedom as freedom from tyranny, not freedom to participate in power. Remember Eric Fromm, the Yale psychologist, developed this freedom to, freedom from? Well, it's freedom from tyranny. We can think arbitrary behavior, the Bill of Rights, freedom from, but we don't take Marcus Cicero's liberating definition of freedom, which is participation in power. And he got it over 2,000 years ago without any email. Freedom is participation in power. Cognition is not ignition. In the Ming Dynasty, in the 14th century, a philosopher said it for all time. To know and not to do is not to know. To know and not to do is not to know. Think of our capability in this country. Do we not know about solar energy, renewable energy, energy efficiency, wind power, which can displace fossils and nuclear? Of course we do. We've known about this for centuries. More refinements now, of course. Passive solar architecture, ancient Greeks, Persians, and East Africans over 2 millennia ago. Do we not know how to prevent a lot of trauma and disease instead of allowing a health insurance industry profit by denying claims and benefits and paying no attention to prevention of disease and trauma? Of course we do. Do we not know about modern public transit? Do we not know about how to conserve soil? Do we not know about how to really get children fascinated and motivated at an early age in learning and doing, both in school and in their community? There are pilot projects everywhere. We're paralyzed. You can't remember the last time we took on a national travesty and solved it, or at least diminished it substantially. So we have to ask ourselves really very, very clearly, are we just engaging, those of us who are most engaged, are we just engaging in a kind of spiral of learning more and more about what is wrong and being unable to do something about it? I look at, for example, prison reform. Lots of people come in, they tell us horrible things going on in the prisons. There's now an effort by Jim Ridgway, great investigative reporter, for many years to deal with the solitary confinement racket. Horrible conditions. And who gets sent to solitary confinement, and why, and for whose profit, and how they're treated there. He doesn't have a budget of $10,000. What if some multimillionaire on Park Avenue is bored and she decides to put 5, 10, 15 million on prison reform? Wouldn't something happen? There are a lot of criminologists who know what can be done. There are a lot of ex-cons who know what should be done. There are a lot of people who know what should be done. The resources are not there. Again and again we see this issue. Name your injustice and ask yourself, has it been well documented? And are there the resources to do something about it? And again, the answer is yes to the first question, no to the second. And this is why I decided to do my first work of fiction. Now, I'm not known as a novelist. This is not a novel. This is what's called a work of political imagination or a work of practical utopia. And it's good to go back into history and know that over 123 years ago, in our country, a book was published called Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy out of Boston, positing a wonderfully just society in the year 2000 in the US. It so excited the early populists and progressives. Eugene Debs would refer to it. It sold a million copies in hardcover, imagine, when the population was 90 million. I read that when I was in high school. It wasn't the most exciting book. But in its time, it was very exciting because it gave people an opportunity to imagine. And without imagining, you cannot envision. And if you cannot envision, you cannot raise each other's expectation levels. And the control of expectation levels is the finest art of tyranny. It's the most effective form of control. Just keep people's expectation levels down. And no one's expectation levels in the Western world is lower than that resides in the American people. Their expectation level of their political system, their economic system, their educational system is very, very low. And so I thought, well, why not choose 17 really super rich Americans who are real people and put them in fictional roles so that it wouldn't just be fictional names that Bellamy used. It would be real names. People that you've heard of, like Warren Buffett, net worth $49 billion. Bill Cosby, Barry Diller, Phil Donahue, William Gates Sr., Joe Jamail, Peter Lewis, Paul Newman, Yoko Ono, Max Palevsky, Gino Paolucci, Ross Perot, Saul Price, Bernie Rappaport, Leonard Riggio, George Soros, and Ted Turner. Those are the 17. I picked them because, one, they were all of advanced age, when they had a different perspective on life, and they knew where the rot was in business. I picked them because they had done things in their lives that were quite enlightening by comparison. And I picked them because they had a great Rolodex. They had a circle. And it starts out with Warren Buffett sitting in his living room in Omaha, Nebraska, and he's watching Katrina unfold. And the day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, these people streaming out, no water, no food, no medicine, no help, on the highways, no shelter, and no one to help them. Helicopters all over. And he can't take it anymore. So he immediately requisitions trucks full of supplies, public health workers, goes down himself and starts passing out material. And everybody is so grateful. And he comes upon an extended family that is in serious trouble in terms of water and food. And the grandmother grabs his hands, looks at him, and says, "Only the super rich can save us." And that haunts him all the way back in his car to Omaha. Only the super rich can save us. And by the time he gets back, he decides what he's going to do. Now, in real life, Warren Buffett had given in installments $35 billion to the Gates Foundation in installments. He started in 2006. You probably saw him on TV. In real life, he's the most successful investor in the world. And in real life, he is a contrarian to Wall Street in many ways. There's a reason why he's called the Oracle of Omaha. For example, a few months ago, he went down to the U.S. Senate and met with senators demanding that they raise taxes on the rich like him. Because he said he paid a lower rate than his secretary. At any rate, none of these people are angels. That's one reason why I could make them very effective. He brings them together in Maui, in Hawaii, on a mountaintop hotel that he rents completely, takes it over. And they plan in January 2000 lightning strategies of civic mobilization down to every congressional district and neighborhoods, and put forth an agenda of long overdue reforms that are on page 76 in the book. And some of them are the obvious ones I've just talked about, in health insurance and living wage. Some of them are institutional development, rooting democracy in the numbers of consumers and workers and people who have to pay the final bills when things go wrong. And they basically lay the foundation in January, February, March, April, May for the inevitable collision with the giant corporate interests. And they do it in a way where, in wave after wave of counterattack by the corporate interests, they couldn't be moved because they were so deeply rooted in every community in the country. They started a clean elections party. They started a People's Chamber of Commerce. They bought their own media. One of them was a media mogul. He just bought an entire network of radio and TV stations and leveraged buyouts. He was doing it in his business all the time. It's a piece of cake. His law firm would just spit out the leveraged buyout deals, and before a few weeks passed, all these TV and radio stations that were buyable or for sale, network in place. They brought hundreds of thousands of people into the center cities, the squares, Fountain Square in Cincinnati and Union Square in San Francisco. Week after week, these crowds expanded as they educated each other with local orators and local organizers. How did they do it? Free lunch, music, and art. That's how they brought them into the center squares of these cities. None of this was lost on our political leaders in Washington, of course. And I put a lot of my experience about what it takes to turn things around in the book. Could be used as a civics course. Certainly it's a little more exciting than your normal civics book, which when I was a child found was so dull it was like reading a ton of sawdust without butter. Now the important thing here is, can you write an imaginative work for a society that's demoralized? Or for progressives who don't read each other's books and hardly meet each other, in contrast to active so-called conservatives who are really corporatists. The showdown comes in Congress because I want the focus to be at a level that we don't exaggerate the intensity of the opposition. The opposition, the corporatist power, is exaggerated in proportion to our powerlessness. The more powerless we feel, the more we exaggerate their power. Once we organize ourselves, the opposition is brought down to scale. We have to believe we hold the final cards. We hold the final reins in dozens of ways in this country, but we're not grabbing hold of them, but they're still there. We have to believe that learning from our history as to how things did change, never as much as they wanted, but they did change, didn't they? Slavery was abolished. Women got the right to vote. Workers were able to form trade unions. Farmers organized the most powerful progressive populist reform movement in American history, starting in 1887. Governors, senators, representatives, radical economic doctrines among the early populists. Dirt poor farmers would talk about monetary systems with a complexity that would befuddle us today. They didn't have a screen to impede their interpersonal conversations and debates and organization. They had to do it face to face. Today we look at screens. And so what it takes is what we really have to ask ourselves. And for that we need to move the tiny minority of super rich who are as enlightened as many of us, but don't have a clue as to how to change things in the country. They know they are very smart and they made a lot of money. Sometimes they think they also know how to make change because they know how to make a lot of money. The two don't follow together. Early on, charity, and I must say, history is a very important teacher here. And in our midst, we have Lou Lapham, the former editor of Harper's, who founded Lapham's Quarterly, comes out 4 times a year, and has a theme like money, power, this, that goes 2,000 years to the present. Imagine just in a magazine format, seeing something go in a very exciting, not dull way from 2,000 years to the present, like medicine. Charity overwhelmingly was ecclesiastically based. It was church. Rich people gave to their church. About 110 years ago, some rich people started their secular foundations. Carnegie, Ford, Rockefeller. And so that was a second stage version of philanthropy. And then later on, some of those foundations and a lot of others began funding advocacy groups. They would fund some public interest law firms like Ford Foundation did in the 1960s and 70s. They helped start NRDC. Or they would contribute money to NAACP or ACLU and local groups too. But by and large, most of the money went into soft charity, not advocating justice. There is a difference between charity and justice. The metaphor is charity starts soup kitchens, justice asks why is there hunger in America and try to get to the root of it. Charity ministers to people in need, which is important. When you're hungry, you're not philosophizing, you want a meal. Charity ministers to people in need, clinics, etc. But justice deals with prevention of the forces in motion that produce such terrible human tragedies. And so some of the money now, the big money, is moving into an arena that you might call advocacy philanthropy. For example, the Gates Foundation wants to fund vaccines to deal with malaria and AIDS, etc. Prevention. Other rich people pour a lot of money into politics. But how many very rich people put money into organizing for justice? What might be called muscle money. Let's call it muscle money. Well, here's an example of muscle money. Medical marijuana would never have been enacted in the States, starting in California, without Peter Lewis and George Soros putting probably $30 million. Never would have been. Whatever you feel about that. That was muscle money. Muscle money was Mayor Bloomberg taking on the NRA and beating it on an issue in Congress recently. That took a few $1 million. That's muscle money. Muscle money in history has been proper Bostonians and New Yorkers putting money in the abolition against slavery movement, or putting money in the civil rights movement. The Stern family and the Curry family in the 50s and 60s, in the early stages, put a lot of money in the civil rights movement. But we need to take it to a new level. There have never been more enlightened, elderly, super rich people in our history. And you can say 99% of the super rich are narcissistic, and they're just concerned about themselves and their circle and their leisure in their advanced age, and they don't really care about the world or the country. But if you stereotype them 100% instead of 99%, you're missing something very important. If someone could have persuaded George Soros to put that money in opposing the Iraq War, we would not have had an Iraq War, and what Joe Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner, says is $3 trillion of its eventual cost, and over 1 million Iraqis dead, and their country blown apart, and more insurgents spreading around the world, and of course our soldiers dying, and coming back brutalized and sick and traumatized. The people in this book, and they did everything I ordered them to do, by the way. The people in this book knew they couldn't do it by themselves. They couldn't get to first base. They had to be top down, bottom up. Now I know it's wonderful to say, when the masses arise, someday the people will organize. Someday they'll march to critical mass levels. Someday they'll take back their government. Someday they'll take on Wall Street. Yes, we will. And we can continue believing that. But if we don't have the resources to do it, how many decades are we going to wait? And I've seen plenty of years go by where the most outrageous increments and magnitudes of injustice that we would never dream would occur now back in the 60s. Like corporate crime in the 60s was tiddlywinks compared to what it is now. Consumer debt, the albatross, student debt, poverty, all of these things, uninsured people, all of these things are worse. A corrupt Congress beyond belief. You can't even call it Capitol Hill. We call it Wuthering Heights. So when is it going to happen? You had the collapse of Wall Street, the greatest demonstrable greed in American history, and power, and self-serving. They tanked their own companies so they could get their own riches off. And it was all front page, folks. It was all on the national news. Nobody covered this up once it broke. They weren't reporting it while it happened. Lehman Brothers, for example, Merrill Lynch. When it broke, it was all front page news. We're the people. We had the only rally in our presidential campaign. We had the only rally on Wall Street in October. It filled that space. Some of you helped organize it. And it was all we could do to get a 680-word article deep in the section of the New York Times. And this was a major issue of the day, including the New York Times recognizing it. They wouldn't even put it on page 1 or in the A section. It never made the local TV, never mind national. We don't have our own media. It's one thing to expose 60-minute style injustices, but if anybody tries to do about it, they're shut out of the media. If anybody says, hey, I just saw this 60-minute thing I'm going to organize around the country, hey, 60 Minutes, 6 months later, put us on. You don't get on. If you say, hey, this is a great page 1 story that the New York Times had recently, we're going to organize around it, they don't report civic activity. So we have to have the resources. Now, this is a grand approach, but it can be broken down into injustices in your own society, in your own community, in your own city. Take New York. You know, just list 10, 15, 20 issues that you'd like to have turned around. How would it be if 10 million, 15, 20, 50, 100 million were put behind this? And think of the gratification. These people never had a better time. It was the greatest year of their life. And they were in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. And once you accept the predicate of super rich, enlightened, older people putting their money behind this type of effort, every page in this book could happen. Every page in this book could happen. And everything that happened in this book, and the country came alive. The country was aroused. There wasn't an area of the country that wasn't touched. $15 billion. The moment the media realized that there was super rich older people taking on the big CEOs, and they had their own media, guess what? They gave them free media every day. Money begets media. There was a point here when Warren Buffett reflected that everything that was spent here was 1/3 of his net worth. I know that this approach is subject to skepticism, But it's happened in our history on a smaller scale, and I mentioned some examples. It's happening to some respects here on a small scale, but it's all a matter of scale. $1 million wouldn't have done enough for those 300 ex-generals, diplomats, and security people retired. $10 million would have done something. $300 million would have been decisive in those 6-month period. And that's what we have to do. We have to raise our expectation level and say to the enlightened, elderly, super rich, we would like to have you exercise your civic responsibilities in accordance with your wealth. When you have someone like William Gates Sr., who organized with Chuck Collins 1,000 super rich people 5 years ago to stop the Republicans from repealing the estate tax, they were engaged in a conflict against their own material interests. These are super rich people saying you should tax estates. So we can see it. It has happened, and it has been successful on a small scale. We want to try to make it on a big scale. And let me just end on this note. We can have a discussion. Today, as we speak, in Congress, they're figuring how they're going to regulate Wall Street. Can you imagine it's been almost 2 years since Bear Stearns, and they still haven't passed anything. When Unsafe at Any Speed came out, this book came out in November 30th, 1965. It was page 1, New York Times. In 9 months, arguably the most powerful industry in the United States was brought under federal regulation. Safety and efficiency, fuel efficiency. 9 months, Lyndon Johnson signed the bill. Harry Truman proposed universal health insurance in the 1940s. We still don't have it. Financial regulation was ripped apart as it was established by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1999 under Clinton and Robert Rubin. And 2 years, almost 2 years after the collapse that looted and drained trillions of dollars of regular people's money, savings, pensions, mutual funds, and millions of lost jobs, nothing has gone through Congress. There is nothing out there in the district. 535 people run by a handful of Wall Street firms, and that's the way I want to end. Congress, Congress, Congress is the fastest way to start turning our country around as if people mattered first, and business where they're served.